Hi, it's Jeff Chalmers here from discoverdouble-bass.com, which is the home of online learning for the double bass. So if you're a player who wants to go further, to learn something new, please go and check out our lessons and courses via the links below. Now, today we're continuing on with our series where we ask questions to the world's greatest double bass players. Today, it's the legends of jazz bass, and we have asked them the following question. Who did you study with, and can you share something they taught you which made a big impact on your development?
So I had a few teachers, like many of us do. All of them gave me valuable information, things that really helped my growth. I think my first classical teacher that I spent some time with was Abe Luboff. Abe Luboff did a number of things. Scales, we worked really hard on scales. We worked out of the Simandl book, both 1 and 2. He worked with me on concerti and sonatas, and so it was great. It was wonderful. Some of the things, I think that one of the things he hammered into me, I still have it written in his handwriting on the cover of my second Simandl book. It says, long tones. I think it says, long tones, damn it. So I had to play 15 minutes every day, long tones. And the story there is, I hated it. He told me that you probably won't like this, but you really have to do it. So I would play every day, long tones, you know, just have the metronome on, dig, 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 tick, 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 and I'd do that for 15 minutes, not loving it at all, and I'd slow the metronome down, you know, after doing it on each string for X amount of time. So, you know, because I eventually wanted to get to the point I was going, that kind of thing. Anyway, so I did long tones forever, and a story, fast forward from lessons with him, I finished school at Indiana University. So it was a couple of years in LA working with Abe Luboff. Then I transferred to Indiana University. I was there for 3 years. I went on the road with Count Basie for 2 years and Monty Alexander for 2 years. And then finally after that, I found myself in a symphony orchestra. And we had to play whatever symphony it was we were working on. And it had this part that had long sustained tones. And I noticed that, wow, my colleagues are having to change bows more than I am. And I went, oh. So it took me, it took me about 8 or 9 years to learn that lesson that Abe Luboff was teaching me. So that, long tones, that was an important one. That was a big one. Studying with Ray Brown, I mean, it's a long list from each teacher, that things that they gave me. But if I was to pick something from Ray Brown, I would say probably it was him screaming at me, telling me I don't even know how to play the F and bass. And the first thing you need to do is you need to learn how to play it from here to the bridge, you know, and then get out there, make some music. And then if you want to come back and do something else, studio work or whatever, it'll still be here. You know, he was really mad at me. So that was a big lesson. But in doing so, one of the things that he helped me with and showed me the importance of was the whole arpeggio thing. You may have seen me demonstrate that, where he'd say, okay, you need to learn all of your major triads, all of your minor triads, seventh chords, all of your minor seventh chords, all of your major seventh chords, with major sevens. All of your major six chords. All of your minors with minor six chords. All of your diminished chords. All of your augmented seventh chords. All of your half diminished chords. I'll start on C, I beg your pardon. So, and the rest. He really hammered that into me. Huge help. Big lesson. All those things in all keys, all over the bass. That really set me up. So that from Ray Brown. I also got to study with Murray Grodner, who was a huge help in terms of orchestral repertoire. So the orchestral repertoire, as well as being a wonderful coach for solo classical pieces. And then I did have a summer that I studied with Eugene Levinson, and that opened up my eyes and ears to the beautiful, romantic, impressionistic way of playing melodies with the whole Russian influence and background.
I've had many great teachers over the years. Jazz bass players, classical bass players, non-bass players, recordings, and being able to see master musicians perform live early on. I think all these things really informed my playing and to see the potential of the instrument. My initial studies with jazz bass players really focused on classical technique, on learning the instrument really well, the fingerboard, to feel comfortable moving through the bass, feel comfortable with the bow on the string, learning certain repertoire. I think all this really gave me a foundation early on of getting comfortable with the physicality of the double bass. My jazz studies were really mostly through performing with musicians who were much better than me at the time, learning from them through the making of music, watching and listening. Also, of course, through listening to all the great records that we have, deciphering what's the information that these records hold. And then, like I said, being able to see some musicians play live was really helpful, to see the physicality, to see the movements that make up the sound. I think a common thread through all these teachers that I had, they showed me that the interconnectedness of all music, and that the bass is kind of at the center of that, and that no matter what the genre, whether it's classical or jazz or R&B or bluegrass, the function of the instrument really maintains itself across the genre. And I think this is a beautiful way to look at music in general, and to see beyond genre, and to see music really as the musicians that we are performing with, the personalities of those that we play with. And if we can study a lot of this other music in depth, we're more prepared to kind of move around into different musical environments. And I think this has really helped me over the years to move with the music no matter what style you might call it, and to be prepared for those musical personalities that I find myself playing next to.
I'm kind of weird when it comes to that, because I came from a small town in Arizona. I come from Tucson, Arizona. There really wasn't anybody to study with. When I was in high school and started playing for real, I didn't start playing bass seriously until I was 15. So like 15, 16, 17, when I was basically practicing. What I did, I don't recommend, but I ditched school. I quit, dropped out of high school. I actually tested out, and I just practiced all day and all night. I played constantly. And there was a teacher at the University of Arizona at the time, Tom Boyd, I believe was his name, but he was a classical player. And I was playing classical and jazz, but I really wanted to play more jazz, and he couldn't really help me with jazz. But he had really good work ethic and practice ethic, and He was a very strong bass player, and he, helped me get like a nice foundation. I only took a few lessons from him because I kind of just went on my own and just kind of quit and just started doing my own thing. But you don't have to study with somebody a lot to actually get something from them. The only other lessons I think I've ever had in my life is I took one lesson with Rufus Reid and I took one lesson with Buster Williams, who were both some of my idols when I was younger. And the rest was just listening and practicing and playing and listening and listening. And I lived in New York City when I was 17 and then when I was 19. And in those days, there were a lot of duet jazz clubs. And I literally would go to the clubs from like 9, 10 o'clock at night and stay there till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5, 6 nights a week. And in those days, if you were young and, you were there for the music, they wouldn't charge you a cover charge. You'd have to buy one drink and I could sit there all night. And I literally would listen to the greatest bass players in the world and the greatest pianists and the greatest players every single night. So, I'm 10 feet away from Eddie Gomez or Ron Carter or, Ray Brown or you name it, and I'm listening to these guys every single night. That was my education of literally listening, watching, playing, getting to know these guys. And just being in that environment taught me so much. And, when I started getting good enough to play with real serious players, they taught me a lot. Piano players taught me a lot. Other musicians taught me a lot just because of what they depend on in a bass player. Hearing their perspective of what they require from me really helped me on the instrument, which was invaluable. So for me, it wasn't about one person. It was about I could learn something from anyone, and at that age, just about everybody I heard was better than me. So it was inspiring. They didn't have to be famous. I learned as much from guys that were just really good players as I did from the stars, because music's music. Everybody's got something to say. Some people, may have more to say or could be freaks about it or do some really crazy pyrotechnical stuff. But that doesn't mean that the guy that's playing the jazz gig on the corner isn't doing an amazing job and really walking through changes, So I learned from everybody and was inspired by everybody. And for me, it was like, I was kind of different because I loved Scott LaFaro, I loved Eddie Gomez, I loved Stanley Clarke, I also loved Ray Brown, I loved Paul Chambers. I love the old school as well as the adventurous. And kind of in the generation of where I grew up, there really weren't many guys that did kind of all of it. It was either like, you're this guy or you're this guy. And for me, it's like, well, wait a second. Why can't I swing? Why can't I have good time? Why can't I play in tune? Why can't I play nice notes? And why can't I solo? And why can't I do some adventurous things and really do some cool things on the bass? Why do I have to pick a style? It's like this instrument is an open, is just a palette. It's like the weak link here is me, not the bass. This bass can be played better than anybody can play it. So I'm the weak link. So why not expose yourself to all these different things and all these different players? So for me, it's like, I want to be a great soloist. I also want to play really in tune, but I want to have a great feel and I want to swing and I want to have really good time. I worked on all of it. And for me, that was really inspiring because anytime you would go down a different path, it would really, it was like, wow, this is cool. This is new. I got to work on this. Oh man, I got to work on this. Oh man, I got to work on this. That's how you grow and that's how you develop.
Yeah, I've had the great experience of having many great teachers. Mike Grace, Dan Pliskow, Stuart Sankey, Ron Carter, David Baker. And one thing I remember from the great David Baker in the whom I studied with at Indiana University, he told me in the first day, it wasn't me, it was the whole class, but he said, you can play whatever you want, just as long as it sounds good. And that just was, it's a very simplistic statement, but it meant the world to me because it meant that I didn't have to explain anything that I was playing. I didn't have to know theoretically what it was. It just meant that if it sounds good to my ear, then use it. And he was really cool about that. Whereas, I've heard other jazz pedagogues say that, oh, you can't use this, no, you can't do this, or you have to do this on this chord, you have to do. But David was like, you can play whatever you want, just as long as it sounds good. So shout out to David Baker, love you, brother, and that's a great tip.
My first bass teacher was Bill Rhine, Bill, we were at my parents' summer music camp in the Berkshires together. Bill was, I think, 15. I was 16. This is 1952, 53. And I was a cellist. Ron Carter and I both started as cellists. I might have developed to some kind of professional level as a cellist. I was never going to be really good because I had no idea about how to practice. And as a kid, I was played the Trout Quintet with Bill Ryan playing the bass part, Ruth Meckler, who later became Ruth Laredo, and a sensational Rachmaninoff pianist, played piano part. Jerry Rosen, who became the associate concertmaster of the Boston Symphony, played violin. All of them younger than I was. And Bill Ryan played the bass part, and I got through the cello part. And Bill, I got interested in playing the bass, and Bill helped me, showed me how to translate cello technique to the bass, showed me how to hold my hand, how to point my first finger down at the low F, no matter where I was on the bass, in order to keep the interval between the first and second finger big enough. So he showed me how to hold the German bow. And I took those things, those basic, essential, fundamental things to heart. I paid a lot of attention to that. And that was the foundation for my playing. The rest of the things that I learned largely from watching other people and listening to them. Bass players who played classical music and more jazz bass players, Oscar Pettiford, John Neves, who was a fine bass player in Boston, Red Mitchell, when I later got to know his playing and was deeply influenced by his legato way of drawing songs out of the bass. So my teachers were, I also studied a little bit with Georges Moller, who was a bassist with the Boston Symphony. By the way, Bill Ryan, this kid that was younger than I was, became the associate principal bass player of the Boston Symphony for a while. There were all these kids I grew up with were better than I was, but I got interested in how other people played, and I paid attention to my models. I watched them and listened to them, and sometimes without conscious awareness, I imitated them. So a lot of my teachers were teachers by example, and I was an independent learner, and the learning wasn't onerous for me. I was attracted to it. I wanted to know how those people were doing what they were doing. So I did everything I could to absorb what that was. I also remember a bass player in New York named Ken Fricker. Ken played, he was a classical bass player mostly. He played with Don Shirley, and I remember I remember how he was a measurer on the bass. Every time there was a shift involved, if there was a shift somewhere up here, there were silent shifts between. If he had to put his fourth finger here, and he was down here, those silent things happened in between. And I watched Ken do that, and he played well in tune. And I needed that kind of incremental measurement in order to be able to get close to being in tune on the bass. There are some bass players who are pointers, who simply go, that's the spot on the bass. Red Mitchell was like that. Larry Wolf, the associate principal bass player in the Boston Symphony, is a pointer. Doesn't matter what finger he uses, he knows the spot where that pitch is on the bass. I'm not like that. I have to measure. And Ken was an effective model for me. He wasn't my teacher, but I was his learner.
Initially, I studied with James Harnett, who was the principal bassist of the Seattle Symphony. This was my first real teacher. We're talking about 1968. Late 67, 68, 69. And he prepared me so well, but it was really a difficult thing because he just put the bow in my hand and said, let's go. You know, I didn't have much of a background with the repertoire whatsoever, so he just pulled out some things that I was capable of trying to get to, and he prepared me well enough that I was able to audition, and I got into Northwestern University, which is north of the city of Chicago, Illinois. And this is where I met Warren Benfield, who was on the bass faculty at the university. And that was really what I was looking for, to go to a university that had a great bass teacher. That was my main concern. But little did I know, this guy was also in the Chicago Symphony. That was a big plus. So that worked out really beautifully, but it even got better because I auditioned as well eventually after a year I got into the Civic Orchestra in Chicago, and that's kind of an orchestra made up of people. The next step would be to get into a major orchestra. And Joseph Guastafeste, who was the principal of Chicago Symphony, was the coach for the Civic Orchestra. So I got a chance to become next to two of these heavy-duty bass players and teachers. They were very different in the way they approached the teaching, which was great. And neither one of them could teach me how to play any jazz, but they could certainly help me work and get the bass, getting a better sound out of the bass, period, because of all the hundreds of years of documentation of how to play this instrument. It was pretty fantastic. Warren Benfield was, well, they were both very, very musical, but Warren Benfield spent most of the time talking about phrases and dynamics and things of that nature. And so did Joe Guastafeste. Eventually I began to take some lessons with him. But his thing was, he was much more technical, particularly his left hand. His left hand were like little hammers, little sledgehammers, and it was amazing. But the sound coming out of his bass, I thought he had an amplifier inside his bass. I mean, the sound he had was so huge. Now, he was the principal of the Chicago Symphony for 49 years. He's 90 years old now, and I still am in touch with him. He's living up close to the Canadian border here, but obviously he retired quite some time ago. But he's a pretty heavy-duty guy, and so it was really great to be able to get with him. But he gave me an exercise to help, you make the sound like this is the sound. This is the sound producer. So that's one string, but instead of doing this to go over to the E string, he would actually pivot. So you could actually hear the tone. obviously we don't play like that, but if you have to really so when you actually the sound is there. So that was a revelation to me, and it really helped my jazz playing because my left hand was stronger. It helped my pitch, everything.
My primary bass teacher was a late great bassist teacher, Oscar Timmerman, when I was at the Eastman School of Music. What he showed me wasn't magic. He showed me how to gain skill and how to use it. At the Manhattan School of Music, my teacher was Robert Bernand. He would spend many hours speaking to me about how to play in an orchestra and all that means.
I studied first with my brother, taught me some electric bass when I was a kid. He taught me a lot of things. And then with Chris Paler, spelled Polar, in San Francisco Bay Area, he hit me to a lot of stuff on electric and urged me to go study classical bass at San Francisco State with Charles Siani, which was around 1977, 78. Then went down to LA, studied with Abe Luboff at Long Beach State for 2 years, left school, went out on the road to play jazz, and wound up studying again as I went on with people like, Tom Martin from London and John Schaefer from New York Philharmonic, and many jazz people just transcribing solos, and just I learned so much from all the gigs that I was wound up being fortunate to be part of with Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock and of course Wayne Shorter's quartet for the last 20 years. So, what I learned from a lot of those people was that if you're going to be an improviser and playing for improvised music, you should learn this music as a language where you begin by mimicking, transcribing, so you learn the syntax, the way they play, the way people phrase, not just the notes, the inflections, the swing, the feeling, all that very expressive stuff, and then you learn the language. So you learn the language of bebop, you learn the language of jazz bass playing, which is 2-beat playing, walking, groove ostinatos, different things in Latin influenced music from Cuba and African rhythms. All those things kind of get swirled into this pot that you have to work on. I learned so much from all these people about all those things. I'm playing with Danilo Perez for many years now. I've learned a lot about different grooves from all over the world. And I had many teachers before that too about Brazilian music, Ayrton Moreira and Alex Acuna for Afro-Cuban music. And lots of different people have taught me many things.
So I grew up in Perth, Western Australia. And I had a lot of fantastic teachers and mentors who really inspired me to get more serious about the music. Bass players like Murray Wilkins and Paul Poorley, and classical bassist Joan Wright, who played in the West Australian Symphony Orchestra. And in addition to that, some wonderful local musicians who sort of took me under their wing, some who had me sit in on gigs, and then eventually I found myself on those gigs. So it's a wonderful place with a wonderful local scene, and I really enjoyed my time there. When I was 19, I went to visit New York City, and I had a fantastic time taking lessons with bass players such as Greg Cohen, Todd Coolman. I remember taking a lesson with Scott Colley, Drew Gress, and one particular really memorable lesson was with Rufus Reid. So this is basically my first time outside of Australia as an adult. Although I was born in Malaysia, I moved to Perth when I was 3 years old. And so I remember taking the train over to Jersey, and I remember not really being a coffee drinker, and Mr. Rufus Reid made me a cup of coffee that was so strong, and I was so buzzed and pumped for the lesson. But we talked about solo playing, and he made me play, I can't remember what piece it was, solo, and we talked about just the importance of really being able to hold your own and have responsibility with the time, with the harmony, with the song, just solo. And to this day I still have his handwritten notes about what I played, and it was great. He was so honest, and it was kind of right to the point and exactly what I needed to hear. He talked about my walking feel sounding a bit too plodding, and I'd heard this from a couple of different people around that same time of like, you need to develop your hump in your beat of your sound, and the hump meaning that sort of driving quality that just makes it really feel really good rather than sort of sitting back and plodding. So that was kind of a real eye-opening moment for me, and yeah, it was a really unforgettable lesson. Then at Manhattan School I studied with Jay Anderson on bass and John Riley on drums, and I've always thought that it's really something important for all musicians to take lessons with other musicians of different instruments, and particularly with the bass. It's really important to take lessons with drummers, and I learned a lot from John Riley about hookup, about time, about rhythm, and he introduced me to a lot of new music that I hadn't heard before, so that was fantastic. And when he was on the road, he would always get fantastic drum subs to come and teach in his place, so I got to play with some great drummers, including Kenny Washington, and I remember Obed Calvert subbing one time, and it was fantastic.
So growing up in my early teens, I studied with a couple bass players. The first gentleman that really introduced me on the bass, his name is Victor Venegas, and he's from Chicago, and he played with Carl Jader, Herbie Hancock, Mongo Santa Maria, and he was a part of my district school arts system. And thank God that he was there, because he was able to take me under his wing and help me understand of the instrument. And he introduced me to many other great bass players like Ruben Rodriguez, Joe Santiago, and Andy Gonzalez. And then he introduced me to somebody that was really important in my life with the bass. His name is John Schaefer. And John Schaefer was a part of the New York Philharmonic from the late 40s, early 50s, all the way to probably the late 80s before he retired and became personal manager of the orchestra. And he taught me a lot about the French bow, and he also taught me a lot about positions and about shifting, you know, and he's the cat, you know, that really taught me about bow weight, using the weight of the arm on the string, not to press hard, you know, use the weight of the string. And he also taught me the motion of the left hand, how to move in a way where you're shifting and not squeezing on the instrument, how to vibrato. There's so much that he taught me, repertoire and whatnot. And if you hear John Patitucci talk about this, we both studied during the same time when John moved to New York, and it was unbelievable to study with this gentleman. And Johnny was unbelievable. I mean, he was an old time cat. Had a cigar, he had his grappa on the side, and he could hear when you're pressing too hard, when you're not pressing too hard, and it made a big impact in my life. And you know, as a jazz musician and as a Latin bass player too, it helps in many ways, understanding about sound, and understanding how to deliver. You know, this instrument is it's physical. It plays mind games, you know, because it's all about physics, and you can't defy physics. You know, the facts are the facts. And you know, when you deal with somebody who was from a certain era, you know, you can kind of learn how they dealt with these obstacle courses. And then as I got older, I started dealing with the same obstacle courses that he was teaching me. And Johnny was a great teacher. Johnny was a great teacher. And at the end of the day, believe it or not, all these mentors that I encountered as a young student, even Patitucci, when I was in high school, he took me under his wing and taught me so much. It was about sound. You know, everyone wanted to find that magical sound, and everyone was working with the bow, with the pits, you know, trying to figure out how can I obtain this beautiful sound that we all love, you know, and without injuring ourselves, because that's the key. The key is not to injure yourself. But yeah, that was my memorable moment with my teachers, and John Schaefer. You know, I owe him everything. So that was it.
So thanks for watching, but what did you think? Did you enjoy this? We would really love to get some feedback from you, and the way to do that is click the like button, leave us a comment, share with us your thoughts, how we can improve this to keep growing and developing it. We need to thank, of course, everybody who contributed to this. There was incredible artists, and you for watching at home. So keep practicing hard, and we'll see you in the next video.